Welcome back to Digging Deeper Ag Chats with Al. In this episode, we're joined once again by vet Chelsea Hare from Herd Solutions, back for her third appearance. Chelsea takes us through everything you need to know about facial eczema in sheep and cattle, from the causes and clinical signs to the practical prevention and treatment options. We also cover pasture staggers and how to spot and manage it in the paddock. And as always, Chels wraps things up with a very interesting answer to our signature question at the end of the podcast. Let's get into it. All right, welcome back, listeners. We've got Chelsea Hare from Herd Solutions back with us for a third appearance. Welcome, Chelsea.
Thanks again for having me, Al.
It's always a pleasure. Tell us, Chels, last we talked, you had a young horse that you were at a bit of a dead end with. Any news on her?
Not really. So what I ended up doing was I just made a decision partially based on my time availability, but also just with sort of looking at her and how she's ticking along. I just decided to give her 6 months off in the end. So she's just sitting in the paddock at my parents' place, having a nice extended holiday. Last I saw her, she was bucking quite out of control in the paddock. So she's obviously not...
Is that a good sign, is it?
I
I'm
think
not a
it
horse
is.
person.
Yeah, a part of me was tempted to go and drag her back out and just see how she felt under saddle, but I've got 2 other horses to ride, and coming into winter I just thought, I'll just let her have some time off, and if there's any little muscle tears or anything like that, hopefully that's all it is, and that's as far as I got. So this time of the year I can't really ride 3 horses anyways. I mean, it's hard to do it at the best of times, but with no daylight savings anymore, I've just dropped back to a single young horse, and that's a bit more manageable. So.
And what's coming up for that single young horse? Any events coming up for you?
This time of year it does start to get very, very quiet. So I'll take him to the Buck and Gymkhana, which is a little local event, just because he needs some miles. So we'll go and do that on Easter Monday. Used to do that every year as a kid, so it's nice to come back and do it again as an adult. So great little community event. And then after that, there's not really much on for me, and yeah, it's getting hard with the lack of daylight savings. It's every horse owner's worst nightmare, having to go back to not having it. So yeah, and we get busier with work coming into now this sort of period as well. So
yep. So do you make a stop off at the radio on the way through? Because that's on the Sunday, isn't it?
I did last year, but I don't know if I'll get there this year because I've neglected a lot of property maintenance that really needs doing. So I think I'll have to be an adult and just fix my fences and water troughs and things like that. So
all the boring stuff.
Yeah.
You're no fun, Chels.
I know.
Okay, facial eczema is the topic we're discussing today. Very quickly, can you just walk us through what is facial eczema in the livestock and why is it a significant issue for both the sheep and the cattle?
Yeah, sure. So facial eczema, it's caused by a toxin called spore, which is produced by a fungus that likes to inhabit a lot of pasture grass species. So the fungus is called Pithomyces shiratum, and I will refer to it from here on in as the fungus because I don't want to have to say that again. And as I said, under certain environmental conditions, it will produce a toxin called spore. And what that does when it's consumed in high amounts in sheep and cattle is it causes photosensitization. So I think a lot of... Which
in layman terms, photosensitization?
It's a very severe sunburn. So I think a lot of producers have often seen 1 or 2 cases, but it causes severe peeling of the skin, nose, sometimes the eyelids as well.
Can it be a similar look to like a scabby mouth type thing?
It potentially can, yeah, because it often in sheep in particular around the mouth is where it's quite nasty. So in sheep it's anecdotally called big head. So in sheep we often see this big swollen head and face where the eyes get really swollen and the lips get really swollen. But with cattle it can sometimes look a little bit different, particularly with dairy cattle we see burnt teat ends, but also because we get a lot of black and white dairy cattle, all the white skin will peel off, but the black skin stays on. So what sort of happens at a cellular level is the spore block bile ducts. And when the bile ducts get blocked, we get an accumulation of a product called phytoerythrin. And phytoerythrin is a normal byproduct of chlorophyll metabolism. So chlorophyll being the green pigment in plants.
Yep.
So when that phytoerythrin accumulates in the bloodstream, it reacts with UV light at the skin level. So that's why we get these typical sunburn type lesions. But the bigger picture problem is that for that to have happened, there has to be severe damage to the liver for that to happen. So we think of it as this skin condition, but really what's actually happening is there's a lot of damage to the liver that's occurring to enable that biochemical process to occur.
And I'm assuming once that damage has happened, there's no ability to heal itself, that liver?
No. So the bile ducts are often scarred once they've been occluded in that manner from those toxins. And the animals can recover, but especially with sheep, the problem we have is that once those bile ducts are all scarred over, the following season when we get another facial eczema challenge, those sheep are more susceptible than they were the year before, and they will require less toxin to get the same degree of clinical disease.
Yep. So you mentioned some of the real clinical signs. Are there some subclinical when we're starting to see a bit of pressure but not quite all that sunburning?
Yeah, often what we might see is animals that are just really irritated. So sometimes people might think they're just really impacted by the flies because they're kicking at the ground and their skin's shivering, and there's also a lot of shade-seeking behaviour because their skin is tingling but it's not necessarily burning off. But also we can just get those subclinical losses with, just reduced weight gain in growing stock, reduced fertility and fecundity in sheep, and other low-grade production type losses that we can sometimes attribute to facial eczema as well.
Yep. So we've figured out what it is, but what are the environmental or pasture conditions that, because it's not always around, is it?
No, well, the fungus is always on the plant,
yep.
But it takes certain environmental conditions for the fungus to start producing those toxins. So typically we need overnight lows of a minimum of 12 to 13 degrees. So obviously we don't see this a lot during winter, but it also requires a lot of humidity because it's a fungus growth is favoured by warm, humid conditions. So, when we see problems with facial eczema, it's usually around March and April because we've got the warm weather, but also a bit of humidity, and also a certain degree of moisture is required in the paddocks as well. So really hot, dry summers don't seem to be quite as much of a risk. Last year we actually saw some cases in around the Buchan and Tambo upper region as far in as May. So that was quite a late season, but the thing with facial eczema spores is they like to live down the bottom of the sward. So when we've got the end of the season, typically around May, that's often when farmers are starting to run out of feed, so they're grazing heavier.
So grazing lower.
Yeah,
yep.
So once we start getting down to the bottom of the sward, that's when we start to see major problems because it's more just it's a dose effect with the toxins. So small amounts animals can handle and clear, but it's when it accumulates in very high levels that it starts to become a problem.
Yeah, and say we've already grazed paddocks down to the boards, are we less at risk because those spores are more open? Do you need some sort of covering to...
What I have read is that really heavily grazed paddocks can still be quite dangerous because what happens is the spore count of the entire feed that the stock are eating ends up being quite high. So what we prefer and what we recommend for prevention is to practice as lighter grazing as we possibly can, so rotating animals as quickly through paddocks as we can without obviously running out of feed, because once you get down to that bottom, it's less of a dilution with the rest of the pasture that's less affected, if that makes sense.
Yeah, right. Yep. The spores don't physically move though, do they?
No, it's not a living thing, it's a toxin, but it's in a spore form, if that makes sense.
So, but each mouthful, they might be taking 10% spores, 90% non-affected. Is that where the concentration?
That's right. And that's why the really heavy grazing's a bit of a risk because it really concentrates the spore ingestion.
Yep. Now, you did mention levels of spores. What are we talking? How do we measure the spore counts?
Yeah, so what we can do is if you do a pasture cut, very similar to how you would take a feed test, you can send them to certain labs and vet clinics that can perform a pasture spore count. So it's actually quite sort of similar to performing a worm egg count. It's not particularly hard to do. You get a dilution ratio where you basically just mix the grass up with water and then decant a small amount off and look at it under a microscope to see how many spores are there, because we can see the spores under a microscope.
Yeah.
And those results are then reported, and there's actually a service freely available by Dairy Australia where you can actually go online and look up Sentinel farms in your area. So because the dairy industry uses a lot of pasture species that are conducive to spore growth, the dairy industry provides that as a service, but there is absolutely no reason why beef and sheep producers can't utilise that. And what I generally recommend is if the spore counts in your local area are getting up to around, say, 20,000, that's the trigger point where you might need to start looking at your own property and perhaps looking at doing some privately done spore counts, because within a region there can be a lot of variation with spore counts, and there can be a lot of variation within your own farm as well, because this pasture species will dictate how many spores are there, but also hill country tends to be worse than flat country, and also certain slope facing regions can also be worse than others. I know in
As
New
in
Zealand.
southern.
Yeah, that's right. So I think off memory in New Zealand they found south-facing slopes are slightly safer than north-facing for some reason. Or I might have it around the wrong way.
I'll have to double check that, because in my mind, if it's a fungus, it wouldn't like the sunlight, but I could be very wrong.
Yeah, and I remember last year when I saw a sheep property, I took 2 samples from an east and west, and I think off memory the eastern side was slightly worse, but they were both very, very high. But
So you said 20,000.
Yeah.
We start checking. What's very high then?
So we say, a danger level is at sort of the 80 to 100,000 spore count mark. But having said that, spore ingestion is cumulatively going to affect an animal as well. So we say that to cause clinical disease, an animal has to be exposed to 600,000 as a cumulative amount. So that doesn't necessarily make any difference whether that's 6 days of grazing on 100,000 or if it's 40,000 for a fortnight, if that makes sense.
Yeah. When does it, obviously that's not a lifetime count, is it?
No, that's in a very
Like a block of
clustered
time.
period of time.
Right.
We're talking weeks, yeah.
Yeah. Very good. So we do have spores in the ground that are high levels. We need to feed the cattle or the sheep. What are we doing to manage it when we get to those sort of points?
Yeah, so the first thing you can do, regardless of whether there's spores there or not, is obviously supplementary feeding can reduce the risk to just dilute the consumption of spores with other feedstuffs. So that's the first thing. But there are some prevention strategies available using zinc as a supplement to neutralise the toxins. So we don't know exactly how zinc interacts with the sporidesmin toxin, but we know that somehow it's basically immobilising the toxin at the skin level and also at the liver level as well. So the thing with zinc is that we need to provide a much higher level of zinc than an animal would voluntarily consume. Mm-hmm. So in the dairy industry, what they do is they get the nutritionists to add extra zinc into pellets, and the cows come in and they eat it every
Just
single
in
day.
The head bale.
In the bale. Yeah. So that's obviously a very easy thing to do, but for for sheep and cattle producers, that's a much difficult thing to do. So in really high risk periods with sheep, you can do twice weekly zinc drenching, which is obviously quite labour intensive. So
just oral.
Yeah, it's an oral drench. In cattle, we can get special use permits for zinc rumen boluses. So it's no different to putting a trace mineral block down the throat.
Yeah. Now, I heard also there are some sort of venturi type systems into water troughs.
Yeah, you can do that for cattle, is my understanding, but sheep don't physically drink enough to consume an adequate amount of zinc. So, yes, that is an option for cattle, but for sheep, unfortunately, it's not. For sheep, there's not a huge number of practical ways to get zinc into animals easily, which is where monitoring spore counts on your own farm can sometimes be worthwhile, so you know exactly what the risk is and exactly how long you have to do it. Because the other thing is that zinc is also a trace element, so it is quite easy to overdose. And we know that because we have to give, as I said, much higher levels of zinc than we would normally see animals consume voluntarily, there is only a small window of time that animals can tolerate that sort of level of zinc ingestion. So the 100-day mark is sort of the ideal window of time that we would supplement for. And beyond that, we generally recommend doing blood tests to make sure that we're not causing damage to the animals by trying to prevent facial eczema.
We've had a couple of podcast guests on here talking about balance in the soil and traces, zinc being one of them, applied. Has there been any studies or, in your observation, people that have a much more balanced level of soil health, these outbreaks of facial eczema and things are sort of not disappear but reduced? Or is there some properties you visit that you think this should have some sort of signs of facial eczema and there's not here?
I don't know if it would so much be with regards to soil health because, as I said before, we're giving technically higher levels of zinc than and even NRC recommendations. So it's a huge amount of zinc compared to what an animal needs. I wonder if I think a big reason we see facial eczema on some farms versus others comes down to pasture species selection, because there are some pasture species that are much more riskier than others, and also grazing management as well. So producers that are on very fast rotations where animals are in paddocks for a smaller space of time and there's more residual left behind are obviously going to be at lower risk than animals that are potentially set stocked on overgrazed pasture. So I think, and also just within farms, there's, different undulations and geography that will be playing a role as well. But it's very sporadic with facial eczema in terms of where we see it and where we don't. So, yeah, it can be really hard to predict exactly where it's going to pop up.
Yeah, I had actually written myself a note to ask you the question on pasture species.
Yeah.
Off the top of your head, do you know what is more likely to carry those spores?
Yeah, ryegrass is by far the worst.
Yeah.
But the safer type of things is obviously anything that's got a legume component, so lucerne, clovers. But also grass species that are somewhat safer are kikuyu and cocksfoot, off memory as well. I think fescue can be a little bit more risky compared to other grasses. But yeah, ryegrass is the biggest culprit. It just tends to be the plant species that the fungus likes to live on the most. But also another thing that can be quite protective as well is people that do cropping with things like chicory, because chicory is a very, very low risk plant feed. So cropping sort of reduces the risk as well.
Now, what about breeding or genetic selection? Is there any work getting done for that in that space?
Yeah, New Zealand has really sort of pioneered the use of facial eczema resistant rams, and I have read in places that they can tolerate much, much higher levels of sporidesmin exposure than animals in control groups. So there is definitely the space to perhaps look at doing better genetics, especially for sheep. I'm fairly sure they even have sheep breeding values over there that can sort of assist producers, which we currently do not have. But there is the capacity to potentially do that if certain regions are having enough of a problem. But I do know that New Zealand tends to be, as far as a global issue, New Zealand by far has the most issues, which I think is probably partly why they've put so much effort into facial eczema control compared to here.
So I have another question coming up actually, which relates to that. Are we seeing sort of a shift in where these outbreaks are starting to occur because of weather patterns are changing, or is it pretty much local to certain areas are more highly prevalent with it?
It's certainly been a disease that the first really bad outbreak that I have read of in history was in the 1930s. So this is not sort of a new disease by any means. But yeah, any sort of weather changes that are going to promote warm, humid weather, which we have certainly had this year, and it's also been quite warm through March, April compared to what we've had in previous years as well. Those sorts of weather changes will definitely be more conducive to an outbreak.
Yep. Right, yeah. But so you need that night temperature to be quite high. So if you're in a really cold area, Tasmania probably wouldn't see much of it.
No, I would not imagine they would see, compared to down here. So.
And is there a heat limit as well if it gets too hot? Is there any issues there?
Not that I know of, no. More so, I guess, potentially because it may cause pasture burn off a little bit earlier, which may then change grazing patterns potentially. So, but not to the fungus or the spore itself, is my knowledge. As long as the humidity's there, it'll survive. So. Now,
are you aware of any economic studies on farm that facial eczema has been costing our industry?
Yeah, I know New Zealand have done some data that have definitely shown, reduced weight gains, fertility, fecundity, and higher risk of culling are all going to be risks with subclinical exposure. So, if we ever go out on farm and diagnose facial eczema, I always sort of recommend that once the outbreak has settled down, we come out and potentially just bleed some animals to see what sort of subclinical exposure has occurred in the flock. Because if there's chronic liver damage, sometimes the most economical thing to do is to actually cull those animals before they
So
get it again. Yeah, it can be, because the problem is that if you get a really bad season the following year, those animals are going to be predisposed to getting it again and potentially get it even worse than they did previously. So they might get it in a subclinical sense the first year, but if we have severe weather conditions the following year, they're already on the backward step towards getting it a second time. So.
Yep, and I'll assume that the productivity for that life of that animal will be reduced regardless of...
Yeah, that's right. So I know New Zealand have got some data that would say that, overall the lifetime productivity of particularly clinically affected animals, but also the subclinically affected ones is lifelong. So.
Yep. Now, is any, just thinking here out loud, younger or older stock are any more predisposed to effects, or is it?
I would say just smaller stock. So younger stock are more predisposed, and also that's why sheep are more susceptible than cattle as well, is because it's a dose per kilo of body weight type thing, and also because sheep will graze closer to the ground than cattle as well. We do see smaller sheep are going to, just on a body weight to exposure ratio, be more susceptible.
And I think I read somewhere it'll put a complete break in your merino wool as well.
Yeah, interesting.
So, and there's no sort of coming back from that depending on where it is in your fleece. So it's a nasty one. So keep a lookout, and, well, we're still quite mild at the minute, so I guess it's still quite prevalent. Or potential for prevalence.
Yeah, and if we don't sort of get a lot of rain in the coming month, as I said, people may start finding that they're running out of feed, and that's when we'll tend to see problems in the coming weeks, I would suspect, is just closer grazing to the ground.
Yep. So if you've got any more questions on that, if you think you might be experiencing some, shout out to Herd Solutions. They got all the lowdown on it, and they'll come out and help you out on farm. Now, another interesting case you had literally this morning was Staggers.
Yeah.
Yep. You want to talk us through? I've got no notes on this, so I'm driving blind at the minute, but talk us through it.
So the Staggers, again, is caused by a fungus that inhabits paspalum. So it's Claviceps paspali, if we want to get the proper name out. And again, it tends to occur in conditions that favour fungal growth, which is warm, humid conditions. And you can sometimes see on the paspalum, they'll have these black seed heads, which is the ergot toxin accumulating on the surface of the plant. And
that wouldn't be the same stuff that's on the fencing wire, is it?
I don't know.
Because you sent me a photo, and I've just realised that's what it looks like on the electric fence wire, actually. Anyway, sorry, go
Interesting.
on. Yeah.
I don't know. But yeah, apparently cattle can sort of consume these fungus-infested paspalum and actually develop a bit of a taste for it. So paspalum staggers causes, as the name suggests, a staggering type appearance, but it can get so severe that, they can appear like they're having seizures and, crash violently into fences and things like that. The disease itself is quite self-limiting, but often animals will die because of misadventure, because they just can't control themselves, and also because there's a lot of muscle tremors. They will get quite hot, and when they get hot, that's why they go into dams, and so they can drown is the biggest issue. So but also just crashing into fences and getting themselves cast and things like that tends to be the usual subsequent cause of death, not the actual staggers itself. So with time and removal off the affected pasture, if we see any early cases, the best thing to do is just to get them off the paddock and somewhere where they can practice safer grazing. But also fencing dams and things like that so that they don't end up in any sort of dangerous position.
Yeah. So there's no drenching or minerals or anything for it? It's literally just
there's no
removing them.
treatment. And often with really bad cases, trying to muster them can actually make them worse. So we often, before people go trying to yard it for us to come out and have a look at them, actually get us to send us a video of what the animal's doing, because if we're suspicious that that's what it is, sometimes yarding them can actually make it worse because you stress them and they actually get more clinically affected just from the stress. So sometimes it's better just to actually leave them alone. So
yeah, and just open a gate and wait for them to walk through maybe or something.
Yeah,
like that.
and just keep them all together with their friends so there's no stress of isolation and things like that, and hope that they sort of find their way into the next paddock as slowly as possible.
Now, just for anyone that's actually looking in their paddocks, the photo that was sent to me, and we can put it up online if need be, the actual seed head that pops up, that's where the actual black, almost soot-looking...
Yeah, that's right. Yep. That's right.
And so if you're walking through your paddock and see that, then that's one thing to be mindful of, I guess.
Yeah. And certainly it seems to have been a really good season for paspalum as well. I seem to sort of see it popping up more and more. So
yep, my socks tell me it's been a good one. So
my horses' faces are covered actually, and it's sticky stuff.
They're susceptible to it too, I'm sure.
Yeah, horses can be.
Yeah.
I think because a lot of horse owners do just supplementary feed as a practice. There's so much other feed available that it's a dilution effect. Because like all things, it's often a threshold of toxicity is when we start to see problems. So
yeah, well, I learned something the other day. Bracken in high levels is quite toxic to horses.
Yeah.
But in low levels, it has a natural diuretic effect or something.
I didn't know that.
Well, I could be making this up, but we'll have to check, so don't take that as case. But yeah, in lower levels, what you're saying, it's okay, manageable, but it's when it gets to those higher levels. Chels, I didn't put this on the email to you, but what's something you've learnt this month that surprised you?
I did learn something interesting. So, the bug that causes fleece rot in sheep, and it also causes foot rot in cattle. So it's called dermatophilus.
Right.
You know what other animal it infects quite often?
Not a echidna.
Crocodiles.
Crocodiles?
Yeah. It causes like some spot disease on the surface of crocodiles, and apparently in crocodile farms it's really disastrous for the skin that they harvest or something.
Multi-talented bug.
Yeah. So it's I think like
do you know what the name is?
It's called dermatophilus.
The bug is?
Yeah.
Dermatophilus. There you go, everyone. Multitasking dermatophilus bug. All right, Chels, thanks very much. Enjoy the Easter break. Don't garden too long. Enjoy the bucking gymkhana.
Will do. Thanks, Al.
A big thank you for tuning in today. And remember, if you have a question about today's episode or a topic you'd like us to cover, reach out to one of our many platforms and join the conversation. We're here because of your passion and commitment to agriculture. Together, we can build a stronger farming future. This episode was brought to you by Herd Solutions, your local farm animal vets, servicing Mafra to Malakuta.
This podcast is made possible by the Future Drought Fund Regional Drought Resilience Planning Program, co-funded by the Victorian and Australian governments.